Okay, so there's this hard rock band from Michigan called Greta Van Fleet. You might have heard of them. Over the last year or so, they've become one of the most popular young rock bands on the planet, getting millions of streams online, selling out shows all over the world, and even winning a Grammy for Best Rock Album of 2018. But alongside all this popularity and praise, they've also attracted a lot of haters. Mostly because their music kind of resembles the sound of another band you might have heard of. Ah, fuck it. I'm not gonna beat around the bush. These guys sound like Led Zeppelin, okay? And not just a bit. I mean, they really sound like Led Zeppelin. From the bluesy guitar riffs to the production to Robert Plant's signature vocal style, they even dress like Led Zeppelin. And as someone who really cares about originality and having your own sound when it comes to music, my first reaction to Greta Van Fleet was fuck this shit. Then I started thinking, is it fair to immediately write a young band like Greta Van Fleet off for sounding too much like another band? I mean, nobody creates their sound out of thin air, and some of the greatest artists of all time wore their influences on their sleeves, especially earlier in their careers. So why do some artists get away with it and others don't? And where do we as music fans draw the line between influence and rip-off? Of course, the answer to that question really depends on the person you're talking to and the artist you're talking about. Because as we all know, music is very subjective. There is no scientifically proven formula for great music or a great album or whatever. Because what qualifies music as great is heavily based on where you're from, how old you are, what kind of music you normally listen to, etc. And though stating that one artist sounds very similar to another artist is something pretty objective, since you can objectively point out the similarities, whether you think it's a problem and artist A is a total rip-off of artist B mostly comes down to personal opinion. But still, there are definitely a few things that can prevent an artist with very clear influences from being labeled a total rip-off, if you ask me. First, improving upon your influences. Because the artist who came up with the sound is not always the one who did it best. Usually, the most innovative artists are the least successful. And though they might have a lot of great ideas, sometimes those ideas need to get polished and developed by someone else to really flourish. For example, the music of British post-punk duo Sleaford Mods borrows heavily from John Cooper Clarke, a British punk poet from the 1970s.
The bloody view is bloody vile, bloody mouth and bloody mouth, bloody babies, bloody cry, bloody flowers, bloody die, bloody food is bloody mop, bloody drains are bloody fuck, colour scheme is bloody brown, evidently chicken town.
Stylistically, it's very similar to Sleaford Mods. And I think it's really cool that Clarke was so ahead of his time with his rap-like delivery and all that, but I like Sleaford Mods music so much better. It just sounds so much more focused and hard-hitting. No disrespect to the legend, but Mr. Clarke never wrote a song as good as this one. Second, having interesting influences. I know it sounds kind of obvious, but if your entire sound is based on one single band that also happens to be one of the most respected and well-known rock bands of all time, yeah, people will definitely consider you a rip-off. But if your influences are a little more obscure, or at least odd for the style of music you're playing, it's a lot easier to get away with ripping them off. Take James Murphy from LCD Sound System. He doesn't shy away from talking about his influences, both in interviews and in his lyrics. And when you listen to LCD's music, those influences are very apparent. But when you take inspiration from acts like Metro Area, James Chance and Liquid Liquid, acts that are not exactly well known, ripping them off is not as much of a problem, since most people have never heard those acts and the people who have don't really give a shit, since you're paying homage to something they think is underrated. I mean, that's why so many music geeks love LCD Sound System.
I heard you have a compilation of every good song ever done by anybody. Every great song by the Beach Boys, all the underground hits, all the modern lovers tracks.
But if there's one thing that separates influence from rip-off to me, it's giving your own spin to it. Because you can improve upon your influences and acknowledge them all you want, but if you don't give your own spin to them, you'll probably still be considered a rip-off. Because I don't think you have to go balls to the wall insane to come up with an original sound. Some artists have very clear and kind of basic influences, but they still manage to sound fresh and exciting. Take the Strokes for example. When they first came out in the early 2000s, they wore their influences on their sleeves. The Velvet Underground, the Modern Lovers, Television, the Ramones. But you wouldn't ever confuse the Strokes with any of these artists. They may not be the most original band on the planet, but you definitely recognize a Strokes song when you hear one. In my opinion, Greta Van Fleet don't do any of these things. They ripped off one of the most basic bands in rock history, and they don't improve upon Zapp's sound or give their own spin to it at all. But then again, I can't be too harsh on these guys. Because I might find their music really still and unoriginal, but when was the last time a young up-and-coming rock band got this much attention? I mean, it's kind of a breath of fresh air compared to all the trap and emo rap that's dominating the charts right now. And is a young band ripping off Led Zeppelin that much worse than the dozens of Drake and Migos rip-offs we've seen over the last few years? I don't think so. And I know it's kind of a cheap excuse, but they're still young, and maybe if we give them a few years they'll develop their sound and become something more than a halfway decent Led Zeppelin rip-off. They're skilled musicians, that's for damn sure. I mean, look at Joey Badass and how he has evolved over the last few years. When he got popular around 2012, his music was pure 90s nostalgia. Boom bap beats, lyrical miracle raps, the whole package. But since then he has really matured and developed his sound, and now I'd consider him one of the most exciting rappers of his generation. I can't say the same thing will happen with Greta Van Fleet, it's really too early to tell, but they have some potential. Although as long as the band and their fans keep denying and ignoring the Led Zeppelin comparisons, I highly doubt it. Because in order to move forward and grow past your influences, you need to acknowledge them, before it's too late. Because all the Zeppelin worshipping baby boomers will die out soon, and their grandchildren will get fake nostalgic for something else. Because there's only so long people will put up with a rip-off before they lose interest. Even if it's kind of a decent one.